Let's talk a little bit about CSS selectors, namely the ID, class, and descendant selectors, and we'll also talk about multiple selectors. So a selector in CSS is something that helps us to be able to narrow down what it is we're styling. So if we look at our HTML, you'll notice that on several of our divs or on even some of our other elements, we can add attributes like ID and class. And these are called selectors because they allow us to basically differentiate one div from another in our styles. So for example, we can target this div that has the ID of featured products differently than we might target this div that has a class of lead article, or this div that has an ID of featured articles. Now we're going to get into the difference between an ID and a class very shortly, but let's just demonstrate a little bit about how these work and how you target them. So let's go to our CSS and start to play a little bit with this. Okay, so let's work on styling our first div. We'll target our div with an ID of content main. Okay, and actually you can see that's happening here. We're targeting just the ID content main. Now we're not actually specifying the div, but really the div is the only thing that has that ID, so it really doesn't make a difference. We could say div hashtag content main. Now this hashtag is basically the symbol that's used for an ID. So anytime we see an ID and we want to target that ID, we would put the element, then a hashtag, and then the actual value of the ID here. So for example, here we have a style that's actually targeting the content main div, the div with the ID of content main. It's setting that div to be 960 pixels wide. It's centering it, which is what's happening here. It's putting a padding around it, aligning the text to the left, within, etc. So we could continue to work on that. We could put a border of 1 pixel solid, just a gray border, and so on. So I'm just going to save that. Let's go take a look, refresh. It's kind of hard to see because it's the same color. Let me change the color a little bit here. I'll just go black. Okay, refresh. There we go. There's our black border. We can make it a little larger even so it's a little more visible. So let's go 3 pixels, switch, refresh. There we go. So we're just targeting that div with that ID. Okay, let's go play with the class here really quick. So let me switch. Let's find one in our HTML. Here we have a class of lead article, and let's take that class and let's make it narrower. So let's come over to our CSS. We'll go let's see, div. We'll target the class, so we'll use a dot for that. We'll go lead article. I believe that was what we called it. Let's check again. Okay. And let's say we're going to give this a width of 75% and padding of 10. Well, let's see, 0 pixels up top, 10 pixels to the right, 0 on the bottom, 0 on the left. And let's just go ahead and also put a border around that so we can see what's happening. Border, 2 pixels, solid, black, save, refresh. Okay, something didn't quite work out there. Oh, I forgot to put my close on it, which is the semicolon. Let's try that again. Okay, there we go. So now it's 75%. Let's make that even a little smaller here. Let's go 65%. Refresh, and there we go. Okay, so the reason I did that is because then we might take this next one, size it down, and put it over here on the right if we wanted to. But you get the idea of how we're going about using selectors to target specific divs. Now let's talk a little bit about the difference between an ID and a class. So let's look at our HTML. Now, an ID is supposed to only occur once on the page. You can get away with using an ID more than once on a page if you're just using CSS, but you don't get valid code when you do that. If you run this through the validator, it'll complain and say you've got an ID showing up more than once. So even though the browser will display it, doesn't mean that it's valid. So an ID is only supposed to appear once on the page. So when I assign an ID of content main to this div, I should not be assigning that ID to any other divs on the page or to any other items. It only is supposed to occur once. Classes, on the other hand, can appear multiple times. So let's scroll down here, and you see I've got this repeating class. So I have product item, product item, product item. So when you use a class, you're using it to style, you're using it really to target multiple elements, to create a style that you can reuse multiple times on a lot of different things. Whereas when you use an ID, you're using it to target an item that only occurs once. So it's really kind of a way of limiting yourself. So, an example here is we created our main content ID because we only are going to have one main content ID that encompasses the whole page. Here we're targeting a span. We're putting an ID of tagline on it because we're only intending to have one tagline. Now, again, will CSS target an ID if it occurs multiple times? Yes, it will, but later on when you get to using JavaScript, not necessarily in this class, but later on, you'll be trying to look for items that use an ID, and JavaScript does care if there's more than one ID. So get in the habit of using an ID only once on the page, and if you're going to use something more than once, using a class.